The dollar trap: how 21 miles of water broke the world's money. On March 22, 2026, the President of the United States went on social media and issued an ultimatum to Iran. Open the Strait of Hormuz in 48 hours, or we will obliterate your power plants. Iran's response took less than 2 hours. If you touch one power plant, we will destroy every oil facility in the entire Persian Gulf region. Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Qatar, Kuwait, all of it gone. And here is the part that no one is talking about. While America threatens and Iran defies, two countries are sitting in silence, watching their bank accounts grow by hundreds of millions of dollars every single day. This is not a war story. This is a money story, and by the time you finish watching this documentary, you will understand why the real weapon in this conflict is not a missile. It is a currency. Imagine a narrow corridor of water, only 21 miles wide at its pinch point, where the ancient land of Persia meets the Arabian Peninsula. This is the Strait of Hormuz, a geographic afterthought on most maps, a mere slit between continents. Yet through this slit flows the lifeblood of the modern world. Every single day, roughly 20% of the entire planet's oil supply passes through here. 1 out of every 5 barrels of oil consumed on Earth navigates this 21-mile gap. Add to that a third of the world's seaborne liquefied natural gas. The numbers are almost too large to comprehend. According to the United States Energy Information Administration, in the year 2025, the daily flow averaged 21 million barrels. That is enough oil to fill over 1,300 Olympic-sized swimming pools. Every day, this waterway is not just a trade route. It is the beating heart of the global economy, and in February 2026, that heart skipped a beat. On February 28, 2026, the United States and Israel launched a series of precision strikes on Iranian nuclear facilities. The world watched the military briefing rooms, but the real action was happening at sea. Within hours, the commander of Iran's Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps Navy, Admiral Alireza Tangsari, made a declaration that would echo through every trading floor and central bank on the planet. Not a single liter of oil, he said, would pass through the Strait of Hormuz so long as Iran was under attack. The order was given. Iranian fast attack boats mined the approaches. Anti-ship missiles were positioned along the coast, and just like that, the valve was shut. The historian Michael Tancham, in his book, The New Spice Routes, had warned that Hormuz was the ultimate choke point, a strategic vulnerability that could unravel decades of economic integration. On that day, his warning became reality. The immediate visual was surreal. Satellite imagery from companies like Planet Labs showed the Persian Gulf transforming into a massive, floating parking lot. The International Maritime Organization, based in London, issued a crisis bulletin describing a gridlock of over 3,000 vessels. Tankers, container ships, liquefied natural gas carriers, all sitting idle in the calm waters. Their cargo was worth billions, but it was going nowhere. On board these ships, captains reported via satellite phone the eerie silence, no engine hum, just the lap of water against hulls. The heat of the Gulf was stifling, and the air carried the faint, sweet smell of crude oil from the vents of supertankers. This was not just a traffic jam. This was the global supply chain having a heart attack. And the first symptom was a number on a screen. The price of oil in January 2026, the benchmark Brent crude oil price had been trading at a comfortable $60 per barrel. Economists called it the new normal. By March 8th, just over a week after the strait closed, Brent crude surged past $100 per barrel. For the first time in 4 years, it did not stop there. By mid-March, it peaked at $126 per barrel. In the United States, the national average for a gallon of gasoline hit $3.94, up more than $1 from just a month earlier. The shock was instant. Airlines saw their fuel costs double. Trucking companies faced bankruptcy. Every product on every shelf suddenly became more expensive to move. But here is where it gets worse. The price spike was obvious, predictable even. The real earthquake was happening in a place few people ever think about, in the quiet, paneled offices of insurance underwriters in London and Bermuda. And this is only the beginning. For centuries, the global movement of goods by sea has depended on a simple, invisible shield: insurance. Without it, no bank would finance a ship, no owner would risk its cargo. The system is overseen by a powerful but little-known entity called the International Group of 12 Protection and Indemnity Clubs. These 12 clubs, based in cities like London and Oslo, provide marine liability cover for an astonishing 90% of the world's ocean-going shipping. They are the ultimate backstop. On March 10, 2026, the international group held an emergency meeting. The risk was too great. They unanimously decided to withdraw all cover for any vessel transiting the Strait of Hormuz. The shield was lifted. Overnight, the Persian Gulf became a no-go zone for insured commerce. The numbers that followed are the key to understanding everything. According to data from Lloyd's of London, the world's oldest insurance market, war risk premiums for voyages into the Persian Gulf had been a negligible 0.05% of a ship's whole value before the conflict. By March 14th, that premium had skyrocketed to 7.5%. Let us be clear. That is a 150 times increase. Think about what that means for a single ship. A modern liquefied natural gas tanker can be valued at over $250 million. Insuring it for a trip through the Gulf now required an upfront payment of nearly $19 million just for the war risk portion. For many ship owners, that was simply impossible. The dollar-based system of global trade, a system that relies on predictable risk and finance, began to fracture. But who were the two countries watching this chaos from the sidelines? And why were their bank accounts swelling? We will come back to that. To understand why this choke point is so powerful, you have to go back in time. The Strait of Hormuz has been a strategic prize for empires for millennia. The Portuguese built forts here in the 16th century to control the spice trade. The British Empire later patrolled these waters to secure its oil from Persia. In the 1980s, during the Iran-Iraq War, what became known as the Tanker War saw over 500 ships attacked. Insurance premiums soared then too, but the global financial system was different. The world still ran on the dollar, and America was a net exporter of oil. Today, everything has changed. A study by the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies notes that Asian economies, particularly China, India, Japan, and South Korea, depend on Hormuz for over 70% of their oil imports. When the strait closes, Asia holds its breath. And in 2026, it was not holding its breath, it was making a phone call. Let us paint a picture with one specific example. The very large crude carrier, or VLCC Ocean Empress, she was loaded with 2 million barrels of Qatari crude oil destined for a refinery in South Korea. On February 27th, she was sailing smoothly through the strait. On February 28th, she received the order to halt. She dropped anchor off the coast of Fujairah in the United Arab Emirates. Her captain, a Greek national named Dimitrios Papadopoulos, gave an interview to the maritime news service Trade Winds. He described the frustration. The cargo was worth over $120 million at the time of loading, but every day it sat, its value fluctuated wildly. More importantly, his crew's insurance was invalidated. They were sitting ducks. Stories like the Ocean Empress were repeated 3,000 times over. The human cost was immense, but the financial cost was astronomical. And remember that number, 7.5%? It comes back later in the worst possible way. The insurance collapse created a domino effect. Banks in New York and London that had financed these ships suddenly faced catastrophic losses. The bonds and loans tied to maritime assets, once considered rock solid, were now toxic. Financial analysts at Bloomberg quickly calculated that over $1 trillion in global trade finance was exposed to the Hormuz gridlock. $1 trillion, that is a 1 followed by 12 zeros. The chief economist of the International Monetary Fund, Geeta Gopinath, issued a warning in a hastily arranged press conference. She said the situation posed a systemic risk to the international monetary system. Those are carefully chosen words. Systemic risk means the whole thing could come crashing down. But what happened next would shock even the people who planned the military strikes. While the West scrambled, a quiet alternative was already being activated. For years, China and Russia had been building a parallel financial infrastructure. They had their own insurance mechanisms, their own shipping agreements, and crucially, their own currencies for settling oil trades. When the international group pulled out, Chinese state-owned insurers, like the China People's Insurance Company, began offering cover to vessels willing to denominate their contracts in Chinese yuan and sail predefined routes agreed with Iran. The premiums were high, but they were available. And Russia, via its state reinsurer, Russian National Reinsurance Company, offered backstop support. This was not charity. This was a strategic move. Every yuan-denominated contract signed in those chaotic March days was a small brick taken from the foundation of the dollar system. But why would Iran agree to this? That is a question with an answer that leads us into the shadows of central banking. We must delve into the data one more time. The closure of Hormuz did not stop oil production. The wells in Saudi Arabia, Kuwait, and Iraq kept pumping. But with no way to export the oil, it started to fill up storage tanks. By mid-March, according to satellite tank tracking data from Vortexa, onshore storage facilities in the region were at 95% capacity. When the tanks are full, the wells must shut in. Production would have to be cut. That meant revenues for these oil-dependent nations would vanish overnight. For Saudi Arabia, which needs oil at around $80 a barrel, to balance its national budget, the math was becoming a nightmare. Yet somehow the Saudi Arabian Monetary Authority reported no immediate liquidity crisis. Money was coming from somewhere. A secret deal was in the works, and it involved gold. But here is where it gets worse. The real story of the Strait of Hormuz is not about geography or even oil, it is about trust. The global financial system is a web of promises, and the ultimate promise is that the dollar will always be accepted. For decades, oil has been traded exclusively in dollars, a fact cemented by the United States-Saudi agreement in 1974. This is what historians call the petrodollar system. Every time a country buys oil, it needs dollars, which strengthens the dollar's demand. But what happens when the oil cannot be bought with dollars? Because the ships cannot get insured, the promise breaks. In March 2026, for the first time, major oil deals were being struck without a single dollar changing hands. The petrodollar system, the silent engine of American economic power for 50 years, began to splutter. And the two silent countries watching, their banks filling with not dollars, but gold and other currencies, were about to make their move. As the sun set over the parked tankers in the Persian Gulf, a different kind of meeting was happening in Basel, Switzerland. The Bank for International Settlements, the central bank for central banks, convened an emergency session. They were not discussing military strategy. They were analyzing payment flows. A report from the Bank of International Settlements, published later, would reveal a startling fact. In the week following the Hormuz closure, the daily volume of transactions using the Chinese cross-border interbank payment system, known as CIPS, doubled. The digital yuan was seeing use cases no one had anticipated. Meanwhile, in Moscow, the Russian central bank governor, Elvira Nabiullina, announced a new gold-backed bond issue. It was oversubscribed in hours. The world was searching for a new safe haven, and the old rules no longer applied. But what did this mean for the average person in America or Europe? The answer lies in a concept called inflation, and it was about to become very personal. This is only the first act. We have seen the choke point close. We have seen the insurance markets fail. We have seen the first cracks in the dollar's dominion. But the closure of the Strait of Hormuz was merely the trigger. The real financial catastrophe was a slow motion avalanche that had been building for decades, and it was now roaring toward every pension fund, every savings account, and every paycheck on the planet. As the world held its breath, waiting for a military solution, a silent and irreversible revolution in global finance had already passed the point of no return. The silent revolution in global finance was now accelerating, moving from shadowy digital ledgers and central bank vaults into the very arteries of world trade. The rule that had governed money itself for 52 years was about to face its most direct assault. Imagine a single idea so powerful that it built empires and funded wars. Imagine that idea printed on every dollar bill used to buy oil from the deserts of Saudi Arabia to the ports of Nigeria. That idea was the petrodollar system, and its story begins not in a war zone, but in a closed-door meeting at the Smithsonian Institution in Washington, D.C. in 1971. President Richard Nixon had just severed the dollar's link to gold, a moment known as the Nixon shock. The world's currency was now a faith-based instrument, backed only by trust and American power. To ensure that trust never wavered, Secretary of State Henry Kissinger and Treasury Secretary William Simon flew to Riyadh 2 years later. They struck a deal with King Faisal of Saudi Arabia, a deal that would shape the next half-century. Saudi Arabia would price its oil exclusively in United States dollars and recycle its petrodollar surpluses into American Treasury bonds and weapons. In return, America would guarantee Saudi security. Every other oil-producing nation in OPEC soon followed. This created a permanent, insatiable global demand for dollars. To buy oil, Japan needed dollars, Germany needed dollars, India needed dollars. This demand allowed America to borrow cheaply to run vast deficits and to project financial power across the globe. It was what former French President Valéry Giscard d'Estaing called the exorbitant privilege, but all privileges must end. And this is only the beginning. For decades, the system seemed unbreakable. The dollar was not just a currency, it was the operating system for the global economy. Then came March 14, 2026. In a sterile studio in Tehran, a senior Iranian government official, later identified as Foreign Ministry spokesman Nasser Kanani, sat for a pre-recorded interview with CNN International. The world was watching the Strait of Hormuz, waiting for any sign of a breakthrough. The official's face was calm, his words measured, but their meaning was tectonic. He stated that Iran would, as a humanitarian gesture, allow a limited number of tankers carrying vital oil supplies to pass through the Mine Strait. There was one condition, a condition that would echo through trading floors from London to Shanghai. The cargo on those tankers must be priced and settled in Chinese yuan, not American dollars. He called it a necessary step toward a multipolar world. In that moment, the petrodollar system did not just crack, it was served with an ultimatum. The financial shockwave hit markets before the interview even finished. The dollar index, which measures the greenback against other major currencies, plummeted 2% in 10 minutes. But here is where it gets worse. This was not a spontaneous act. It was the culmination of a decade-long strategic pivot, a financial war fought in plain sight. For years, Iran and Russia had been weaving a dollar-free web of trade. The governor of the Central Bank of Iran, Mohammad Reza Farzin, had stated publicly in 2024 that they had entered into a comprehensive currency agreement with Russia and fully removed the dollar from all bilateral transactions. They now traded only in Russian rubles and Iranian rials. By 2024, according to data from the Central Bank of Iran and the Bank of Russia, 96% of all transactions between the two nations were conducted in these national currencies. This was not a minor shift. It was a total excision of the dollar from a critical trade corridor. Meanwhile, to the east, Russia and China had been building their own monetary universe. By 2025, as reported by the People's Bank of China, 55% of all bilateral trade between the two giants was settled in Chinese yuan. They were creating a system that ran parallel to the dollar, a system that did not require New York clearinghouses or SWIFT messaging. And remember that number, 55%. It comes back later in the worst possible way. The groundwork for the yuan ultimatum had been laid brick by the expanding BRICS alliance. Originally Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa, the group had grown to include Iran, Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Ethiopia, and the United Arab Emirates by 2024. Together, they represented over 45% of the world's population and a massive share of global commodity exports. For years, their summits had issued statements about reducing dependency on the dollar. They discussed a common BRICS-esque currency. They launched alternative payment systems like China's CIPS. But they lacked leverage. The Hormuz crisis handed them that leverage on a silver platter. When a nation that controls 20% of the world's seaborne oil trade said, "You must use yuan," the calculus of global power changes instantly. Analysts at the International Energy Agency had been warning for years. In their 2023 World Energy Outlook, they noted that about 20% of the global oil trade was already conducted in non-dollar currencies, including yuan rubles and UAE dirhams. That number was a slow creep, a background hum. The ultimatum turned that hum into a deafening roar. But what did this mean for the very architecture of money? To understand, you must follow the insurance. As one senior risk analyst at Lloyd's of London wrote in a confidential memo later leaked to the Financial Times, when the insurance system pulls back from dollar-denominated shipping, the dollar-based shipping system itself begins to fracture. In the days after the ultimatum, marine insurers faced an impossible choice. Could they insure a tanker carrying a yuan-denominated cargo if the payment system was outside their legal jurisdiction? What happened if the yuan payment was frozen by Chinese capital controls? The uncertainty caused premiums for any voyage involving non-dollar oil to skyrocket by 300%. This created a de facto two-tier market. Dollar oil was scarce and trapped. Yuan oil was available, but perilously expensive. To ensure this fracture began to spread. European refiners, desperate for feedstock, started opening yuan accounts with Chinese banks for the first time. The digital yuan, which had been piloted in cities like Shenzhen, suddenly found its killer app. It allowed for instantaneous, traceable settlement without touching the dollar system. And this is only the beginning. The real threat was structural. The petrodollar system had created a circular flow. Oil importers sold goods to the United States to earn dollars, then used those dollars to buy oil. Those dollars then flowed back to oil producers who parked them in American assets. This circle kept the dollar strong and American borrowing costs low. Iran's yuan ultimatum punched a hole in that circle. Now, dollars were not needed for a growing portion of the world's most vital commodity. The permanent demand for dollars began to erode. Economists call this the Triffin dilemma, named after Yale professor Robert Triffin, who warned in the 1960s that a reserve currency country must run deficits to supply the world, undermining confidence in that very currency. For 50 years, America managed this dilemma through the petrodollar. Now the escape valve was closing. The consequences would be profound, and they would touch every single person with a dollar in their pocket. But what happened next would shock even the people who planned it. To grasp the sheer audacity of the move, consider the history. In 2003, when the United States invaded Iraq, one of the first acts of the Coalition Provisional Authority was to reopen the Iraqi oil exchange exclusively in dollars. It was a stark reminder of the link between oil currency and geopolitics. In 2017, Venezuela's President Nicolas Maduro announced he would price oil in euros and yuan to circumvent American sanctions. The attempt failed because Venezuela lacked the market power. Iran, sitting on the Strait of Hormuz, did not lack that power. They had learned from history. They had also learned from scholars like Dr. Hossein Askari, a former IMF official and professor at George Washington University, who wrote extensively about the instability of a unipolar financial system. In his book, The Petrodollar Paradox, he argued that the system contained the seeds of its own destruction by incentivizing adversarial nations to build alternatives. The ultimatum was that theory made terrifyingly real. The world's central banks watched, and they began to move. According to the International Monetary Fund's currency composition of official foreign exchange reserves data, the dollar's share of global reserves had already fallen from 71% in 2001 to 59% by the end of 2023. The pace of that decline was now about to accelerate. In the weeks after the ultimatum, sources within the Central Bank of Malaysia told Reuters that they were doubling their yuan holdings. The Russian Finance Ministry announced it had completely zeroed out its dollar reserves, a process started after the 2014 Crimea sanctions. But the most significant move came from an unexpected place. Remember the number 55% for Russia-China trade. That number was a warning. It showed that even economies not directly involved in the Hormuz crisis were preparing for a dollar-light world. And here is where it gets worse. For the average American family, all of this still felt distant, a complex game of financial chess played by distant powers. But the connection was direct, and it was about to become painfully personal. The petrodollar system had long acted as a subsidy for the American lifestyle. It kept interest rates low, it kept the cost of imports cheap. As demand for dollars began to waver, that subsidy would vanish. The cost of everything from gasoline to groceries was tied to the strength of that little green piece of paper. And that paper was now under attack not by missiles, but by monetary policy. As the yuan began to flow through the Strait of Hormuz, a chain reaction was set in motion that would reach the heart of Wall Street and the pockets of every American family. But the story does not end with currencies and oil tankers, because when the dollar stumbles, the entire global debt market, a market worth over $300 trillion, begins to tremble. And that trembling would soon turn into a quake that no one could stop. But the tremors in the currency markets were just the prelude. Because in Washington, a different kind of pressure was building, a pressure born not of strategy, but of a ticking political clock. The world was about to witness a move so blunt, so publicly broadcast, that it would rip away any remaining veneer of control. The date was March 22nd, 2026. The time just past 10 in the evening Eastern Standard Time. In the quiet of the White House residence, or perhaps from a mobile device at Mar-a-Lago, a single post was published. It was not a statement from the Situation Room. It was not a coordinated diplomatic cable. It was a message from one man, President Donald Trump, sent directly into the digital ether. The words were stark, a digital ultimatum written in the language of a real estate deal gone bad. He wrote, if Iran does not fully open without threat the Strait of Hormuz, within 48 hours from this exact point in time, the United States of America will hit and obliterate their various power plants, starting with the biggest one first. The post was time-stamped. The clock had started. Think about that for a moment. A threat to plunge a nation of 85 million people into darkness, delivered not in a sealed envelope to a foreign ministry, but to the world in real time. This was not the Powell doctrine of overwhelming force. This was not the measured escalation of the Cold War. This was a 48-hour dream, a fantasy of decisive action that ignored every lesson of modern warfare and complex statecraft. The financial markets, which never sleep, saw it immediately. The reaction was not a rally, not a sigh of relief. It was a silent digital gasp. The 48-hour countdown had begun, and with it, the final shred of certainty evaporated, and this is only the beginning. In Tehran, the response was not silence. It was not a frantic call to the United Nations. It was a mirror held up to reflect the threat back across the entire Persian Gulf. In less than 2 hours, a statement from the Iranian military high command flashed across news wires. It warned with chilling specificity that the Strait of Hormuz would be completely and permanently closed if the United States delivered on Mr. Trump's threats. But they did not stop there. They painted a target on the entire region's economic heart. The Speaker of the Iranian parliament, Mohammad Bagher Ghalibaf, a former mayor of Tehran and a commander in the Revolutionary Guard, made the stakes terrifyingly clear. He stated, immediately after the power plants and infrastructure in our country are targeted, the critical infrastructure, energy infrastructure, and oil facilities throughout the region will be considered legitimate targets and will be destroyed in an irreversible manner. Let that sentence sink in. He was not just talking about Iranian oil, he was talking about Saudi Arabian oil facilities. He was talking about the gleaming refineries of the United Arab Emirates. He was talking about the liquid natural gas terminals of Qatar, which supply Europe. He was talking about the pipelines of Kuwait. All of it, the entire apparatus that moved 1 million barrels of oil every single day, was now on a kill list. This was the doctrine of mutual assured destruction, applied not to nuclear warheads, but to the very pipelines and control rooms that fueled the global economy. An associate fellow at Chatham House's Middle East and North Africa program, Dr. Sanam Vakil, would later explain the fatal miscalculation. She said it was unlikely Tehran would cave into the pressure, citing a profound lack of planning and the fact that the Trump administration did not foresee the scale of the Iranian response. They saw a strongman's bluff. Tehran saw an existential red line. The question is, why did the White House not see it coming? The answer lies in the chaotic 24 hours before the post. Just one day prior, President Trump had reportedly floated an idea to his advisors. He suggested they could simply declare victory and end the war, leaving the Strait of Hormuz closed. He argued the United States could survive on its own shale oil, that it was time to let the rest of the world fend for itself. The idea was a political escape hatch, but his military and intelligence advisors presented him with a single undeniable chart. It showed the price of benchmark Brent crude hitting $230 a barrel within 90 days of a permanent closure. It showed the complete collapse of several major European banks with massive exposure to Middle Eastern sovereign wealth funds. It showed unemployment in the United States spiking to levels not seen since the Great Depression. The Strait of Hormuz was no longer just a strategic waterway. It had become the one issue he could not walk away from, even as he desperately looked for an exit. The 48-hour ultimatum was not a strategy. It was the purest form of geopolitical desperation. And in Tehran, they knew it. They had studied this moment for decades. They remembered the words of their own strategic doctrine, often repeated by former Revolutionary Guard Commander General Qasem Soleimani, that in an asymmetric war, your strength becomes your opponent's greatest vulnerability. Saudi Arabia's gargantuan oil infrastructure was not its shield. It was its Achilles heel, a sprawling network of pipelines, pumping stations, and export terminals impossibly difficult to defend against a swarm of cheap drones and missiles. A confidential risk assessment by the consultancy firm Control Risks, leaked months later, had given the Abqaiq processing facility in Saudi Arabia, the largest in the world, a critical vulnerability rating of 9.7 out of 10. Iran had those same reports. The 48-hour window began to feel less like a deadline and more like a fuse. And here is where it gets worse. Behind the public bravado, a frantic, hidden calculation was taking place in trading desks from London to Singapore. They were not just betting on war or peace. They were pricing in the irreversible. Analysts at energy research firm Rystad Energy ran the numbers on Ghalibaf's threat. The complete destruction of Saudi Arabia's key processing facilities at Abqaiq and Khurais, which had been narrowly saved in a drone attack in 2019, would take at least 7 million barrels per day offline for a minimum of 6 months. The attack on Qatari LNG facilities would wipe out 20% of global liquefied natural gas supply instantly. The math was apocalyptic. You did not need a missile to hit a single tanker in the strait. You just needed the credible threat that the entire Gulf Arab energy system was a target. That threat, now voiced publicly by a senior Iranian leader in response to an American president, was more valuable than any weapon. It immediately created what traders call a geopolitical risk premium that could never be unwound. The price of oil did not just spike. It underwent a fundamental re-rating, a permanent reassessment of risk in a region once considered stable. But remember that number, 7 million barrels. It comes back later in the worst possible way. As the first 12 hours of the ultimatum ticked away, a strange paralysis set in among the United States Gulf allies. The Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman was reportedly furious. He had been assured of American protection of the inviolability of the United States security umbrella. Now, an American presidential post had directly invited the destruction of his kingdom's economic lifeblood. A senior Emirati diplomat, speaking off the record to the Financial Times, called it the ultimate betrayal of free riding. He said, "You do not set fire to your neighbor's house to scare a cat in the alley." The trust, the unspoken contract that had held for 50 years, was incinerated in one night. This fracture had an immediate monetary consequence. The Gulf Cooperation Council, a loose monetary union, had always tacitly pegged its currencies to the dollar, recycling petrodollars back into United States Treasury bonds. That automatic reflex stopped. In Riyadh and Abu Dhabi, central bankers quietly instructed their sovereign wealth funds to pause all dollar-denominated bond purchases. They began to accelerate a discussion that had been theoretical, a joint digital currency backed by a basket of commodities that could operate outside the dollar system entirely. The petrodollar recycling machine, already sputtering, now threw a rod. And yet, in the White House, there seemed to be a belief that the sheer force of the threat would work. This belief was rooted in a misreading of history, in the ghost of a previous confrontation. Some advisors pointed to the year 1987, when the United States Navy escorted flagged Kuwaiti tankers through the Strait during the Iran-Iraq War. Iran had mined the channels, fired missiles, but ultimately backed down. What they failed to understand was the fundamental difference in Iran's capabilities. In 1987, Iran could harass shipping. In 2026, Iran could, by its own assessment, close the strait completely and hold it closed for months through a layered defense of sea mines, anti-ship missile batteries, and swarms of armed drones. A war game conducted by the United States Naval War College in 2023 had concluded that reopening a hostile Strait of Hormuz would require a land invasion of the Iranian coast, a commitment of forces and political will that no American administration could muster. The 48-hour ultimatum was a threat to start a war that the United States had already gamed itself into losing. The clock kept ticking. 24 hours in, the silence from Tehran was deafening. They had issued their counter-threat, and now they waited. They were allowing the pressure to build not on them, but on Washington. They were allowing the images of shuttered stock, exchanges in Asia, and skyrocketing insurance for tankers to flood global media. They were letting the market do the work for them. Every minute that passed made the United States look weaker. Every minute made the global financial system bleed just a little more. An emergency meeting of the United Nations Security Council yielded nothing but recriminations. The Russian ambassador smirked and asked if the United States was now issuing foreign policy via social media. The Chinese delegate expressed grave concern and called for all parties to exercise restraint, while Chinese state media ran segments explaining the stability of yuan-denominated oil futures. The trap was closing, and what was the American president doing during this precarious silence? He was reportedly watching cable news coverage, fixated on the polling numbers about gasoline prices in Midwestern swing states. The grand geopolitical standoff had been reduced to a domestic political problem. The 48-hour dream was collapsing under the weight of its own contradictions. You cannot bluff when your opponent holds all the cards that matter, and Iran held the card labeled mutual economic annihilation. But here is where the story twists, because while the world watched the two capitals, a third group was making the most important calculation of all. They were not in government buildings. They were in the glass towers of Manhattan, in the hedge fund bunkers of Greenwich, Connecticut. They were the architects of the global debt market. For them, the ultimatum was not a political drama. It was a crystal clear signal. It was the signal that the United States, the world's ultimate guarantor of security and stability, had lost control of the narrative and was acting from a position of profound weakness. And when the guarantor weakens, the thing it guarantees becomes risky. What the United States guarantees more than anything else is the $300 trillion global debt market, a market built on the foundation of the United States dollar. They saw the frozen petrodollar recycling. They saw the Gulf states hesitating. They saw the yuan gaining a foothold, and they asked one terrifying question. If the dollar's dominance is underpinned by a security guarantee that is no longer credible, what is our debt actually worth? That question, whispered on trading floors as the 48-hour clock entered its final day, would soon become a scream. But what happened next would shock even the people who thought they had planned for everything. The scream began not with a bang, but with a quiet, steady drip of currency into a new set of vaults. While the world's attention was fixed on burning tankers and the rhetoric of war rooms, a profound and silent transfer of wealth was underway. It moved in the dead of night across frozen steppes and digital pipelines, from the accounts of desperate buyers into the coffers of two nations that had positioned themselves perfectly for this exact moment. The first was the most obvious winner, a country that had been financially bled for years, but now found its veins pumping with liquid gold once more: Russia. In the first 15 days of March, as the strait remained sealed, Moscow was pocketing approximately 372 million euros every single day from its oil exports alone. That figure was 14% higher than its average daily earnings in just the previous month of February. Between March 1st and March 15th, Russia hauled in 7.7 billion euros from all fossil fuel exports, a torrent of cash combining oil, gas, and coal. But the real story was in the price of a single barrel. For years, Russian Urals crude, sold under the shadow of sanctions, was a discounted commodity. Delivered to ports in India, it languished around $40 per barrel. Then, in barely 12 days, it did the unthinkable. It surged, it rocketed past 60, then 80, and clawed its way to nearly $100. Overnight, a resource that was a liability became a geopolitical weapon and an economic lifeline. Analysts at the International Energy Agency, poring over shipping manifests and insurance documents, calculated that Russia could receive between $3.3 billion and $4.9 billion in additional revenue by the end of March alone. But that was just the opening act. If the war and the blockade dragged on through the summer and into the fall, a chilling estimate emerged from the financial analyst at the German magazine Spiegel. Russia could pocket up to $250 billion in additional revenue. To understand the scale of that number, you must remember what came before. Just months earlier, Russia was suffering. Global oil prices were softening. Its crucial sales to India, its largest crude buyer, were faltering under intense pressure from Washington. The treasury financing Putin's war in Ukraine was staring at a slow, painful constriction. Then the Iran war began. The blockade of Hormuz did not just rescue the Russian energy industry, it rescued the Russian war budget. It supercharged it. Every missile fired in Ukraine, every soldier paid, every tank rebuilt was now indirectly funded by the chaos in the Persian Gulf, funded by the very global panic that American actions had helped unleash. And this is only the beginning. The money flowed east, but the real victory was not just in revenue. It was in the complete inversion of the old financial order before the war. Russia sold its oil in dollars or euros, a constant vulnerability. Now, with traditional European buyers gone and new Asian partners eager, it could dictate terms. And the term it dictated, alongside its new de facto ally Iran, was a simple one: yuan. China was winning, but it was winning a different kind of war. Its victory was not measured in daily cash flows, though those were immense. Its victory was measured in the frantic activity of showrooms from Jakarta to Hanoi and in the long-term unshackling of its economy from the volatile tyranny of oil. The crisis in the Strait triggered the greatest acceleration of electric vehicle adoption the world had ever witnessed. It was a shockwave of demand that made previous growth seem sluggish. In China, BYD showrooms, the nation's automotive champion, were buzzing with families not just browsing, but buying, driven by a visceral new fear of the gas pump. But the revolution was most visible in Southeast Asia, a region perpetually on the cusp of an energy transformation. In Hanoi, at the flagship showroom of VinFast, managers had to scramble to hire more sales staff. Customer visits had quadrupled in the 3 weeks following the blockade. They sold 250 electric vehicles in that same period, double the average rate of 2025. Each sale was a small declaration of independence. A study by the Center for Strategic and International Studies in Washington laid out the staggering math. China's existing electric vehicle fleet, already the world's largest, was saving the country over $28 billion per year in avoided oil imports. Globally, electric vehicles saved 1.7 million barrels of oil consumption per day in 2025. That is the equivalent of 70% of Iran's total pre-war exports, simply erased from demand. The blockade did not just raise the price of oil, it permanently annihilated future demand for it, and China owned the factories building the replacements. And here is where it gets worse for the old system. China was not just selling the future. It was buying the present at a spectacular discount, While Europe and America scrambled and paid premiums for whatever oil could be rerouted, China was sitting at the head of the table. It had two desperate suppliers, Russia and Iran, both slashing prices to compete for its business, both increasingly willing to accept payment in China's own currency, the yuan. The 25-year Comprehensive Cooperation Agreement between Iran and China, signed in 2021, was no longer just a piece of paper. It was a strategic masterstroke. It had secured China the right to buy up to $400 billion of Iranian oil at below market prices. Now, with Iran's oil trapped and needing a buyer, and Russia eager to lock in a massive new client, China played one against the other. The discounts grew deeper. The terms grew sweeter. China got cheap, secure energy for its industries. Russia got the revenue to fund its empire. Iran got a lifeline, and the dollar, once the mandatory middleman in all such transactions, was politely shown the door, remember that number, $400 billion. It comes back later in the worst possible way. The financial circuitry of the world was being rewired in real time, and the new connections bypassed Wall Street and the city of London entirely. They ran on a direct current between Moscow, Tehran, and Beijing. To see the human face of this trillion-dollar shift, you could visit the bustling port of Zhangzhou. Their supertankers bearing Russian and Iranian flags, their hulls riding low in the water, offloaded their black cargo. The payments were settled instantly through the cross-border interbank payment system, China's alternative to the Western stub IFT network. The transaction was digital, seamless, and invisible to the dollar-based monitoring systems that had once ruled global finance. For the Russian oil trader, it meant survival. For the Chinese refinery manager, it meant predictable costs in a time of chaos. For the American Treasury official watching the data, it meant a creeping, undeniable reality. The petrodollar, the lifeblood of dollar demand for 50 years, was being systematically drained and replaced, but what were the real-world consequences of this quiet victory? In Moscow, the mood shifted from siege mentality to a grim, confident calculation. Analysts at the Central Bank of Finland, in a report titled "The Resilience of the Sanctioned Economy," detailed how the windfall was being used. A significant portion was funneled into the National Wealth Fund, a war chest that had been steadily depleting. Another portion was used to stabilize the ruble, which had been volatile. But most ominously, it allowed for a massive increase in military-industrial production. Factories in the Urals that had been working 2 shifts went to 3, then 4. The very engines of conflict were being lubricated by the world's panic over oil. In Beijing, the calculation was longer term. Scholars at the Chongyang Institute for Financial Studies at Renmin University published a paper calmly titled "The Accelerated Timeline." In it, they argued that the Hormuz crisis had effectively fast-forwarded China's energy transition plan by 5 to 7 years. The public rush to electric vehicles was a bonus. The real prize was the locking in of decades of discounted hydrocarbon energy bought in yuan, which would fuel the very industries that would build the post-oil world. China was using the last great gasp of the fossil fuel era to finance its own dominance in the era that would follow. And this precise mechanism, this diabolical feedback loop, is what the planners in Washington had failed to foresee. Their actions to secure oil had made oil more valuable, enriching their adversary Russia. Their actions had made oil so valuable and so scary that it pushed the entire world faster toward alternatives, turbocharging the industry of their rival China. Every move to reinforce the old system only served to bankrupt it faster. But the most profound winner was not a country at all. It was an idea, the idea that the global financial system could and must have an alternative to the United States dollar. For years, it was a theoretical discussion in academic conferences. Now, it was a daily practice in the most important commodity market on Earth. The economist and historian Adam Tooze, in a bleak newsletter published from his office at Columbia University, called it the weaponization of everything and the inevitable bloody-minded search for a workaround. When you weaponize the dollar, he wrote, you force the world to develop financial body armor. Russia and China were now clad head to toe in it. And the body armor was being paid for every single day by every single person on Earth who paid a higher price for gasoline, for bread, for shipping, for existence. The winners were counting their billions. The losers were counting the coins left in their pockets. Yet, even as this new axis of financial power solidified, a terrifying question began to form in the minds of the very traders who had first whispered about the dollar's weakness. They had seen the petrodollar fracture. They had seen the rise of the yuan in commodity trades. But a global currency needs more than just oil contracts. It needs depth. It needs liquidity. It needs the unwavering trust of investors who must park their life savings in it for decades. Could the yuan, backed by a closed and opaque financial system, truly replace the dollar? Or was the world not moving toward a new single hegemon, but shattering into unstable, competing blocks? The answer to that question would determine the fate of every pension fund, every mortgage, every savings account on the planet. And the shockwave that would provide the answer was already forming, not in the deserts of the Middle East, but in the electronic heart of the world's oldest and most powerful bond market. Remember the architects of the global debt market watching from their glass towers. They had asked what their debt was worth if the dollar's security guarantee failed. Now, they were about to get their answer. It would arrive not with a diplomatic cable, but with a single staggering number flashing in red on a trading screen. A number so large it would break the modern world. That staggering number began to form in the quiet of late March 2026 as the war entered its fourth week with no end in sight. In trading rooms from New York to Shanghai, screens glowed with data that told a story of slow motion collapse. The architects of the global debt market watched. Their questions about the dollar's worth now met with cold, hard calculations. But this was not just about bonds or currencies. This was about time. Every day the strait remained closed, the world burned through another layer of its economic resilience. And as the calendar turned, a terrifying question emerged. What happens if this continues for one more month? The answer was not a guess. It was a forecast etched in numbers by the most powerful financial institutions on Earth. The Dallas Federal Reserve had already run the models. Their calculation was stark. The closure of the Hormuz Strait, which removed 20% of global oil supplies, would lower global real GDP growth by an annualized 2.9 percentage points in the second quarter. That is not a slowdown. That is a plunge toward a cliff. Goldman Sachs, seeing the same shadows, raised its official probability of a global recession to 25%. 1 in 4, a roll of the dice with every pension fund and every job on the table. And remember, these were not worst-case scenarios. These were the base cases, the expected outcomes if the conflict simply persisted. The Harvard Business Review issued a warning that felt like a verdict. If oil remained at $140 per barrel through the year, the United States would enter a full recession. Not a technical dip, but a painful contraction that would ripple through every main street and every household. But here is where it gets worse. Across the Atlantic, the European Central Bank sounded an alarm that had not been heard since the debt crisis of the past decade. A prolonged conflict, they said, would trigger stagflation, that cruel combination of rising prices and stagnant growth. It would push economic giants like Germany and Italy into a technical recession by the end of 2026. Eurozone GDP growth would slow to just 0.5% year on year. Imagine the entire European project built on stability and prosperity grinding to a near halt. And China, the world's factory, was not immune. Its growth, the engine that had powered global trade for decades, could fall below 3%. A number that would have been unthinkable just years before. These were not abstract statistics. They were the early tremors of a financial earthquake. And this is only the beginning. To stave off disaster, nations reached into their emergency closets. 400 million barrels of oil were released from global strategic reserves, a temporary life raft thrown into a stormy sea. But that measure, as every analyst knew, could not last more than a few months. It was a gesture, not a solution. Meanwhile, in a desperate move, the United States waived the Jones Act, that century-old law protecting American shipping. Tankers were rerouted through the longer, more dangerous path of the Red Sea. Each voyage added weeks to shipping times and billions of dollars in costs, a tax on the global economy paid not in currency, but in time and risk. The physical world was straining under the pressure. Food prices began a relentless climb because the fertilizers from the Gulf region, essential for crops from Iowa to India, were blocked. Metals, chemicals, and countless manufactured goods that depended on Gulf shipping were delayed or simply unavailable. Supply chains, already fragile, started to snap. The World Trade Organization added its voice to the chorus, warning that if oil prices remained high for the rest of the year, global GDP growth would be reduced by 0.3%. A small number, perhaps, but in a world of $80 trillion economies, it represented trillions in lost wealth, millions in lost livelihoods. But what happened next would shock even the people who planned for the worst. Because the war in Iran was not just a military conflict, it was a financial earthquake. The petrodollar system, the invisible architecture that had underpinned American economic dominance for half a century, was cracking under pressure from a 21-mile wide waterway that one country had the power to close. For decades, oil traded in dollars meant that every nation needed dollars, propping up its value and funding American debt. Now, with the flow of oil choked, that need began to evaporate. And remember that number from the bond market. It comes back later in the worst possible way. As the United States struggled, other powers moved. Russia, sitting on vast reserves of oil and gas, was getting richer by the day, its currency bolstered by panic and scarcity. China, reading the geopolitical tea leaves, accelerated its transition away from oil, investing billions into renewables and electric vehicles, not just for the environment, but for survival. They were building a firewall against the very dependency that was now crippling the West-estimated, and the United States, with the most powerful military in history, was discovering a brutal truth. It could not force open a shipping lane without risking a wider war that would destroy the very economy it was trying to protect. The weapon was useless. The dollar trap had been sprung. But let us pause for a moment and look at the human cost behind these numbers. Picture a family-owned trucking company in Ohio. Their diesel costs have doubled. Their shipments are delayed. They are staring at bankruptcy within weeks. Picture a baker in Paris watching the price of flour soar because fertilizer is stuck on a ship somewhere in the Indian Ocean. Picture a factory worker in Guangdong, China, told their overtime is cut because the components from the Middle East have not arrived. This is the granular reality of a global breakdown, and every one of these stories is a thread pulling at the fabric of the financial system. Now, introduce another question. What happens when governments, faced with this crisis, start to break the rules? We saw hints of it. The Jones Act waiver was just the start. Would nations begin hoarding resources? Would trade agreements be torn up? Would the rules-based order that had governed commerce since World War II simply unravel? The answer was brewing in the corridors of power, and it would change everything. But back to the countdown. One more month, the models assumed a linear progression, but reality is rarely linear. Economists call it a nonlinearity. A tipping point, a moment when the slow burn becomes a wildfire. The Dallas Fed model did not account for the psychological break, the moment when confidence shatters. And that moment was closer than anyone thought. Consider the bond market the deepest and most sensitive market in the world. It had been asking what its debt was worth if the dollar security guarantee failed. Now, it started to vote. Yields on long-term United States Treasury bonds began to spike erratically, not because of inflation data, but because of fear. Fear that the entity backing those bonds, the United States government, was losing its fundamental source of power, the petrodollar. And that fear had a number, a single, staggering number flashing in red on a trading screen. We will get to that number soon, because it is the key to the entire catastrophe. For now, know that the countdown was not just on calendars. It was in the algorithms, in the high-frequency trades that sniff out weakness before humans even notice. It was in the hushed conversations between central bankers scrambling to arrange currency swaps to keep their banks liquid. It was in the empty docks where tankers should have been. One more month meant the strategic reserves would be half empty. One more month meant the rerouted shipping lanes would become clogged and dangerous. One more month meant that the inflation numbers would cease to be a worry and become a political monster. The European Central Bank was trapped, forced to choose between fighting inflation with higher rates and killing growth, or letting prices run wild. There was no good choice, only less bad ones. And this is only the beginning. In Asia, the story took a different turn. China, while suffering slowing growth, saw an opportunity. With the dollar under stress, the yuan began to appear in more commodity trades, not just for oil, but for metals and agricultural products. But as we learned earlier, a global currency needs more than just contracts, it needs trust. It needs depth. Could the yuan, backed by a closed and opaque financial system, truly replace the dollar? Or was the world shattering into unstable, competing blocks? That question hung over every market, a sword of Damocles waiting to fall. And the shock wave that would provide the answer was not just forming in bond markets. It was forming in the everyday lives of people who had never heard of the Strait of Hormuz. A taxi driver in Nairobi paying more for fuel. A retiree in Florida watching their savings shrink. A student in Berlin wondering if their job offer will still exist next month. This is how a financial earthquake feels on the ground. Not as a chart, but as a knot in the stomach. But here is where it gets worse. The war was not the only variable. Nature decided to add its own chaos. Unseasonal droughts in key bread baskets, exacerbated by climate change, meant global grain stocks were already low. The blockage of fertilizers from the Gulf pushed the system toward a breaking point. The World Food Program issued warnings of famines in vulnerable regions. So now, the financial crisis had a humanitarian face. And that, in turn, fueled political instability, which fed back into the markets, a vicious cycle with no off-ramp. Remember, the architects in their glass towers, they were no longer just watching. They were acting. Hedge funds began betting against the euro. Pension funds quietly shifted assets into gold and Swiss francs. Central banks in emerging markets burned through their dollar reserves to prop up their own currencies. Each move was rational in isolation, but together they were a stampede and the bridge was cracking. Now, let us return to that number. The one that would break the modern world. It arrived on a screen in Chicago in the futures pit where oil contracts are traded. The price of West Texas Intermediate crude did not just spike. It gapped. It jumped from $140 to $170 in a matter of minutes. Not because of a new missile strike, but because of a margin call. A major European energy trader, over-leveraged and unable to secure financing, was forced to sell everything. The cascade that followed was instantaneous. The number was $170. But the real number was the trillions in derivative contracts that were suddenly underwater. The modern financial system is built on derivatives. Side bets on the price of everything. At $170, those bets started to implode. Banks that had seemed rock solid faced liquidity crunches. The digital heart of finance skipped a beat, and that skip was enough. Credit, the oxygen of the economy, began to freeze. Companies could not roll over their debt. Projects were canceled. Jobs were lost. The recession was no longer a probability. It was present. And it was global. This was the moment the dollar trap snapped shut. The petrodollar system, already cracked, now fractured. Nations realized that relying on a currency tied to a choke point controlled by a hostile power was an existential risk. The transition away from the dollar, once a slow drift, became a route, but not toward one currency. Toward chaos, bilateral trades in yuan, rubles, rupees, and even barter deals emerged. The global financial system shattered into blocks, just as the scholars had feared. Efficiency was sacrificed for security. Costs soared, growth evaporated. And in the middle of it all, the Strait of Hormuz remained closed, a 21-mile-wide scar on the world map and a monument to a failed idea. The idea that money could be separated from geography, that finance could float above the messy realities of oil tankers and shipping lanes. It could not. The dollar was trapped by the very system it created. So where does that leave us? As the dust settles, the world is poorer, more fragmented, and infinitely more cautious. The age of hyper-globalization is over. The age of financial sovereignty has begun, with all its inefficiencies and risks. The United States is still a powerful economy, but it is no longer the indispensable nation. China has not won. Russia has not won. No one has won. We have all lost. The Strait of Hormuz did not just break the world's money. It broke our faith in the system that held that money together. And rebuilding that faith will take more than treaties or interest rate changes. It will take a new story, one that acknowledges a simple, brutal truth. Money is not just numbers on a screen. It is a promise, and that promise is only as strong as the narrowest waterway we depend on to keep it. That was the dollar trap, how 21 miles of water broke the world's money. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this documentary, subscribe to our channel for more. We bring you fascinating documentaries on history, science, civilizations, mysteries, and the untold stories that shaped our world. Hit the bell icon so you never miss a new release. Until next time.